So yes, if you are in need of a restroom, you'll go ahead and come this way. You will also find in that direction some they're like headphones that amplify sound. So if you are hearing impaired or need just to hear a little bit more of what's going on, feel free to grab one of those headsets. As you may or may not know, it is the summer game. Summer game! Ah! You will see a code. It is ride and read. It looks from here, it looks like ride and dread. But it's it's a ride and read. So make sure you get your summer game points on the way out. This is, as I was saying, the final event for this year's Big Gay Read. So if you came to any of the other events, it's good to see you again, and thank you for doing so. We've had so much fun this year, particularly with the country western theme. So it's been a hoot, and I just want to give everyone, I wanted to say thank you, and thank you for coming out tonight. Yeah, let's clap. When in doubt, just clap. Yeah, and be gay. Clap and be gay. I can do both. So a little bit about our speaker. Sarah Gailey is a Hugo Award-winning writer of fiction and nonfiction, known for their genre-bending, boundary-pushing work. Their debut novella, River of Teeth, which is currently for sale at that table behind you, was a Nebula and Hugo finalist, and they've since published multiple novels and short stories that explore identity, power, and survival through speculative lenses. In addition to writing novels like The Echo Wife and Magic for Liars, Gailey is a columnist for the New York Times and Tor.com, where they cover everything from sci-fi tropes to emotional world building. Let's give a big Ann Arbor welcome to Sarah Gailey.
Hello, my friends. I'm Sarah Gailey, and I am coming to you tonight from my hotel room in beautiful downtown Ann Arbor, just around the corner from the Ann Arbor District Library, where you're sitting right now, where I am so infuriated to share that I have just tested positive for COVID-19. For the first time, I'm infuriated to be losing my streak. I'm obviously very sad to not be there with you tonight. But more than that, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for coming out and to the Ann Arbor District Library for making this incredible pivot at the last minute in order to prioritize your safety and the safety of the staff there, rather than letting me give all of you this wretched virus. I do have other things going on in my life beyond having a virus that is making me feel like something that got scraped off the underside of a high school chem lab table. I'm also the author of Upright Women Wanted. Now, this book is about living under an authoritarian regime that achieves its goals by deprioritizing public and social services, leaving people to fend largely for themselves while tightly controlling what media and literature they have access to. People often ask me how I went about developing the world of Upright Women Wanted, which is a near-future fascist-controlled American dystopia. I always tell them the same thing. I took a close look at how existing and historical fascist regimes treated the people who lived within them. And I saw the future that many people in power want for this country. I wrote about that future, a future in which the government prioritizes the consolidation of wealth and power, corporate profit, and imperial expansion at the expense of the material, physical, and social needs of citizens, using violence and strict control of information to pursue those goals and enforce compliance. It's vital to understand that there is a direct relationship between state-inflicted violence and state-governed control of information. Tonight, we're going to take a closer look at that relationship so we can come to a shared understanding of the purpose of authoritarian media censorship and the necessity of learning to identify oneself as a criminal in the eyes of the state. Before we begin, I do want to make sure you're aware that tonight's talk will include discussion and images of police activity and conditions of incarceration in the American prison system. I think this subject is well worth your attention and time, but if the subject matter isn't something you think you can engage with here tonight safely, I'd encourage you to watch this talk at home later. There'll also be a transcript on my website, which I will publicize on social media for you, so that you can attend to your physical and emotional needs safely. And bonus, since I'm not there in person, I won't even see you getting up and leaving the room right now, so you don't have to worry about hurting my feelings. Not that you can hurt my feelings worse than COVID has. But to get a better understanding of authoritarian media censorship, we're going to do exactly what I did when I was researching Upright Women Wanted. We're going to look into history. But rather than looking at the history of Germany or Italy or Japan, all of which I studied quite extensively for this book, we'll be sticking a bit closer to home. In the 1920s, the American film industry was in desperate need of image rehabilitation. And this breaking point came along due to, among other things, the murder of silent film director William Desmond Taylor and the trial of actor Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was accused of sexually assaulting and killing Virginia Rapay. We can't know the actual events that led to Rapay's death, but the accusations and trial against Arbuckle were unquestionably motivated and informed both by intense fat phobia directed at Arbuckle himself and by a popular perception of Hollywood as debauched and immoral. Now, prior to this, in 1915, the United States Supreme Court had already unanimously ruled in Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio that motion pictures did not qualify for free speech protections. This decision states that, and I quote, "However missionary of opinion films are or may become, however educational or entertaining, they may be used for evil. Their power of amusement, and it may be education. The audiences they assemble, not of women alone or of men alone, but together. Not of adults only, but of children, make them the more insidious in corruption by a pretense of worthy purpose, or if they should degenerate from worthy purpose." As a result of this Supreme Court decision, individual state governments imposed censorship guidelines on all film and cinema. They leveraged fees and fines for those who failed to comply with the new standards, but they didn't publish or share those standards anywhere. So film producers had no way of knowing if their work was compliant with those standards until they started encountering consequences. After a few years of dealing with this, Hollywood realized it needed to get ahead of state government censorship. It also wanted to ward off the looming promise of united federal censorship. So in 1922, Hollywood established the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America to manage a system of self-imposed censorship guidelines. A man by the name of Will H. Hayes accepted the position of chairman. This role would make him arguably one of the most influential figures in the history of American cinema. Under Hayes, the MPDAA steered Hollywood into a culture of preemptive compliance. This was a kind of compliance that Hayes, alongside his close colleagues Martin Quigley and Daniel Lord, were more than comfortable with. Together with several studio heads, those three led the process of creating a code that would define acceptable content in American cinema, formally from 1934 to 1968. Now, although the Hayes Code, as it was known, would be formally retired in the late 60s, the ripples caused by the code are still with us in the room today, both the room I'm in and the room you're in. So, what was the Hayes Code? Well, it went through several iterations, including a loose but actually quite effective list of don'ts and be carefuls. Here's the version that lasted. Don't worry, I am not reading this whole thing to you. We'll be here all night, but here are the general principles for you. Number one, no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Hence, the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. Number two, correct standards of life, subject only to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. Number three, law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. Things got a lot more granular from there. Notably, crimes against the law shall never be presented in such a way as to throw sympathy with the crime as against law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire for imitation. The sanctity of the institution of marriage and the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing. And the treatment of low, disgusting, unpleasant, though not necessarily evil, subjects should always be subject to the dictates of good taste and a regard for the sensibilities of the audience. Now, those 6 principles have significantly defined American media for the past 90 years. There are undeniable parallels as well between the full content of the Hays Code and the content of a similar set of guidelines established in 1954 and written largely by Judge Charles F. Murphy on behalf of the Comics Magazine Association of America. Similarly to the Hays Code, this comics code was self-imposed industry-wide censorship, and it developed in response to a moral panic of the era that was kicked into high gear by psychiatrist Frederick Wortham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, supposedly an examination of the influence of horror comics on today's youth. The result of this moral panic was the attention of U.S. Senator Estes Kefauver, who led a televised Senate hearing that targeted comic books. The result of this Senate hearing was the death of 15 comics publishing companies. And in response to that climate, the Comics Code was born. Now, the Comics Code generally discouraged sex, violence, gore, queerness, just about any content that might bump the reader's heart rate above 50 BPM. But a few notable points from the code for our purposes here tonight. Crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous, or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. And in every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. Now, William Gaines, publisher of EC Comics, a company that was heavily targeted by the language of the Comics Code and Senator Kefauver's Senate hearing, fought back against Murphy and the code. One notable anecdote, which I cannot verify the exact particulars of, but which is a legend of the comics industry, goes something like this. In 1953, Gaines attempted to publish a comic called Eye for an Eye. He was denied by the Comics Code Authority. He decided to print Judgment Day instead, a comic in which an astronaut visits a planet of robots, only to find that the robot society is structured around color-based discrimination. At the end of the comic, which I'll remind you was printed in 1953, the astronaut is revealed to be black. Judge Charles F. Murphy instructed EC that the astronaut would need to be changed from black to white. Gaines, that publisher of EC in the previous slide, pointed out that this type of requirement was listed nowhere in the Comics Code. When Murphy said, "Come on, we both know why you have to change this, go do it," Gaines responded, "Yeah, okay, thanks for letting me know, bestie. I'll change it and then I'll hold a press conference and tell everyone what you made me do." The result, Murphy wound up giving the comic the necessary approval rather than risk the exchange going public, although of course gossip networks wound up spreading the word anyway, which is part of what gossip networks exist for, so good job, industry gossips. This is just one way in which creatives fought the censorship projects of the Comics Code and the Hays Code. They recognized across industries the dangers of these efforts, and they worked courageously to oppose censorship at every opportunity, just as we work to fight it today. The similarities between the Hays Code and the Comics Code are not coincidental. Not only because one can clearly see the lineage between the two codes, Charles F. Murphy was inspired by both the Hays Code and an existing unenforced code belonging to the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers, but because they're working toward the same goals. These are the goals supported by contemporary book banning efforts by groups claiming to be protecting children, like Moms for Liberty and the Florida Citizens Alliance. The immediate goal of these efforts is control over what narratives people are exposed to. The terminal goal of that effort is to control people's actions. The path from point A to point B is one of moral instruction, using narrative limitation to change the way people think about what is or is not acceptable. We can see this explicitly outlined in the text of the Hays Code. The motion picture, within its own field of entertainment, may be directly responsible for spiritual or moral progress, for higher types of social life, and for much correct thinking. The goal is to change the way you think. By framing media as directly responsible for spiritual or moral progress, the Hays Code shifted the function of American cinema from entertainment to instruction. In compliance with this requirement, American media in general moved into a mode of telling viewers not only how to behave, but how to feel about what they're seeing. It's not enough for someone on screen or in a book to be evil and do evil things. We need to be told that they're evil, and that everyone in the end of the story is in agreement about their undesirability. In this way, the Hays Code imposed a violent standard of moral purity on media that has fundamentally shifted how we view ourselves, our history, our culture, and by extension, evil. The bad element must be obvious and malignant in order for us to recognize it. We, the viewer, must know with whom we are meant to agree. We must also know whom we are meant to abhor. This, per the ideals of the code, is how citizens learn to uphold society. As a result of this educational approach to media, multiple generations of media consumers across various forms have become oriented toward uncritical consumption of facets of media that are intended to instruct us on morality and personhood, which leads by design to the dehumanization of those who have been uncritically presented as inherently villainous. The constant reinforcement of the notion that people can't consume media without being instructed by it has led to an expectation of media as morally and ideologically instructional. As a result, we frequently anticipate in our media, and especially in our villains, the confirmation of what is good and what is bad. And the archetype of a criminal is overall and by default, according to the media and literary landscape you and I currently inhabit, bad. This returns us to the content of the Hays Code and the Comics Code that focuses on criminals and criminality. Now, those two censorship codes put a lot of mustard on the way criminals are to be treated in appropriate media. Why is that so important to a censorship effort? And recalling that both of these censorship efforts were driven by preemptive compliance with anticipated and impending federal censorship, why might this treatment of the criminal serve the interests of an oppressive state? In order to get to the bottom of this, we need to dive into some specifics of terminology. So first, let's ask, what is a criminal? Is a criminal someone who is evil? Is a criminal someone who causes harm? Not necessarily. In fact, those ideas are functionally immaterial. A criminal is someone who breaks a law. It's as simple as that. No person or object or property needs to come to harm in any way in order for a crime to be said to have occurred, provided that a law is being said to have been broken. And by contrast, great harm can be perpetrated without the perpetrators being labeled criminals. And yet, when we talk about criminals in contemporary media, we tend to frame their actions as synonymous with causing harm in some way. And even when the narrative is on the side of the criminal, the story tends to be clear that the criminal is appealing in spite of being villainous, or that the criminal is unique among criminals and therefore likable and redeemable. This philosophy jumps out at us quite clearly in the Comics Code. Crimes shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal. And criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation. In narratives that follow these guidelines that across the Hays Code and the Comics Code shaped American media for decades. Crime, and by extension criminals, are necessarily bad. They are something different from you and I, from normal, upstanding citizens. This changes how we think it's acceptable to treat criminals. The narratives we consume repeat over and over again that criminals are and should be treated differently from other people because they are a different kind of creature. So if we look at popular media, we can see a reflection of how our society broadly agrees it's okay to treat a criminal. And if we look into real life examples, we can get a window into how people we label as criminals are treated day to day by the American police and detention system. This treatment, both in media and in life, is a reflection of the conflation of the identity criminal with the identity villain and with the identity problem. We thus end up identifying a criminal as an element to be removed for the improvement of society. This assumption then leads to our society supporting and protecting the forces that promise to remove the undesirable element, even to the extent of enabling them to perpetrate harm without consequence. So, all right, let's go ahead and separate the concept of harm from the concept of crime. We've established that a criminal is simply someone who breaks a law. In that case, we must understand what is a law and what is it for. The great philosopher Brennan Lee Mulligan once said, "Laws are a threat made by the dominant socioeconomic ethnic group in a given nation. It's a promise of violence that's then enacted." This is a perfectly succinct summary of the concept of law, a promise of violence as a consequence for any action that opposes the interests of that dominant socioeconomic ethnic group. It's vital to remember that crime is defined not by the people at large, but by that dominant group, as represented by legislators. Legislators represent not the interests of the people, but the interests of that dominant power group, which we call the state. So, what are those interests? And how does the law protect them? Well, for example, a country that's focused on capitalist growth and imperialist conquest needs citizens who obey authority, who express and act on patriotic and nationalistic loyalty, and who produce workers. In a society that's founded on the ideals of white supremacy like our own, those workers should either be white or readily exploitable. So if we identify these as the needs of our hypothetical example state, we can then examine the laws of that state and uncover how they work to protect state interests rather than the interests of the citizens. It then starts to make sense that citizens acting in their own interests, when those interests oppose the values of the state, can be rebranded as criminals and then subjected to punitive violence. When we understand laws to serve the interests of the state rather than the interests of individual people, the popular framing of criminal as evil starts to make a lot of sense. It serves the interests of the state for you personally to consider someone who breaks the law to be a different category of creature, who deserves to be treated differently than you, who deserves whatever violence they experience at the hands of the state they have undermined with their actions. Now, that violence we would never accept in any other circumstance, is thus categorized as simply a consequence of breaking the law. If we're going to work under that assumption, though, that this violence is just a consequence of breaking the law, we need to be able to count on the idea that we know what the law is. That you and I will never be transformed into that creature called criminal, and thus become something deserving of state-inflicted violence. Unfortunately, this strategy does not work, because the law is not concrete. It changes constantly. Until the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, there was no such thing as an illegal immigrant in the United States. Although the status of citizen was limited, the ability to enter the United States was open to everyone, and was in many cases forced upon the unwilling. Before 1882, you could legally enter the United States with the intention of living here, no passport or visa required. After the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Someone completing a perfectly legal journey they may have started years earlier might find themselves ending that journey as a criminal. In 1919, it was perfectly legal in the United States to consume, transport, or sell alcohol. And then suddenly in 1920, the same actions that would render a person a respectable business owner 1 year before became crimes. Meanwhile, it wasn't until the Supreme Court decision in the case of Lawrence v. Texas in 2003 that homosexual intercourse was decriminalized. Prior to that decision, any gay couple sharing a bed would be handed the label criminals and treated as such. Right to expect a life free from state-inflicted violence. This is especially true if the state's goals and interests shift in a way that makes it convenient for you to inhabit the category of criminal. If that convenience is enough of a priority, you may be removed from society first and have a crime assigned to you after the fact. As we've recently seen in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, an activist who was arrested and detained for 9 days before being handed a post hoc charge. That means a charge of criminal activity after arrest and detainment. He was charged with falsifying information on a green card application. And it took 104 days of legal battle just to get him released from detention. In spite of having committed no provable crimes, it was convenient to the interests of the state for him to be treated the way we treat people we decide are criminals. It is, of course, impossible to know how Mahmoud would have been treated if he'd been a Kyle instead of a Khalil. But the rhetoric inflicted upon him by the state and its allies took full advantage of every possible weaponization of identity, including and not limited to referring to him as a terrorist, in spite of no evidence of any activity on his part that could possibly be interpreted as such. This is just one example of the way the state is prepared to use identity, your identity, as a cudgel to pursue its aims. The goal of this post hoc charge was to revoke Khalil's legal status in the United States in order to deport him. Criminality and citizenship are both forms of legal status, and they're equally mutable. The state assigns a legal status to you, and the state can remove it based solely on the goals of the current regime. I walked into this hotel room with a legal status of citizen and non-criminal. But Project 2025, the blueprint for the legislative goals of the current political administration in the United States, outlines a clear plan to change that. First, by recategorizing queer and trans narratives as pornography. And then, by making the production of anything in the category of pornography illegal. For all I know, by the time I'm recovered from COVID, the legal landscape of this country could have changed in a way that redefines who I am in the eyes of the law, and thus in the eyes of the state. I am, at any given moment, Schrodinger's criminal. And so are you. So are all of us. So what do we do with this information? How do we move forward? How do we create a different world together? How do we embody the spirit of William Gaines and fight this effort to control what we read and what we watch and how we think and who we consider human? Well, first, and this is a big lift, we have to make a constant practice of compassion for the criminal. Yes, all criminals, all of them. Criminals are people you personally need to care about and fight for, not just because it's good and right to extend universal compassion to all living creatures, and not just because exercising the muscle of compassion is part of pursuing a rich and loving life. Okay, yes, we have all that, and maybe those reasons are enough for you, but for a lot of people, they're just not. If you are one of the people for whom those reasons aren't enough, this project is still in your direct personal interest, because your criminal status is not within your control. Your behavior can never be correct enough to prevent you from being assigned the status of criminal. For all you know, this is anyone's future. Your kid's favorite teacher who tells them it's okay to be different. The local librarian Who recommends your favorite new books to you? Your queer best friend, your mother, your father, your sibling, your spouse, your child. For all you know, this is you. As of today, you may consider the prior actions of any given criminal to be totally unfathomable, despicable, disgusting, outside of any action you can imagine yourself or anyone you know taking. Frankly, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with holding deep personal principles and maintaining a practice of morally consistent actions rooted in those principles. Or you may consider yourself separate from the criminal. After all, you pay your taxes, and you don't drive very far above the speed limit. You use the crosswalk when you cross the street. You mind your own business. You come to events at your local library. Maybe you think the question of criminality simply doesn't apply to you because it's not part of your life. Or you may consider yourself separate from some, but not all criminals. You may already have compassion for some criminals. Maybe there are some criminals you admire because their actions align with your principles. No matter how connected to or distant from the idea of a criminal you currently consider yourself, we are dealing with a growing authoritarian regime that is deeply invested in an increase in media and literary censorship. That means that being in this room and reading the books that you read to be here tonight could make you, in the eyes of the state, indistinguishable from a person who did real, material, physical harm to a vulnerable human being. It could make you a criminal. So, regardless of where you stand on this, regardless of where you see yourself in relationship to the criminal, you must always remember that in the eyes of the state, the criminal that disgusts you, and the criminal you admire, and the criminal you might become are indistinct. You have no power over what punishment you receive once you are identified as criminal. You all suffer at the same discretion of the same state for breaking the law, whether you knew you were breaking it at the time or not, whether it was established as law at the time or not, whether it makes sense or not. It does not matter. When you agree that the state should be allowed to inflict violence on the criminal from whom you consider yourself different, you are agreeing that the state should be allowed to inflict violence on your neighbors and your loved ones and yourself and your children. So that's the first thing we're going to try and change. We're going to stop agreeing to that violence. We're going to speak up for the criminal when we hear others agreeing to that violence. We're going to pursue justice and protection on behalf of the criminal. That's the first thing for us to work on. And here's the second. We must fight media and literary censorship at all costs and on all fronts. Media and literary censorship allows the dominant group to steer your perception of what is and is not acceptable, of who is or isn't a villain, and of how people should or should not treat each other. Now, these two fights are deeply connected. If you have unlimited access to unlimited narratives and perspectives, you are at risk of critical thinking. You might start developing your own perspectives on these issues, feeling compassion for people who are labeled criminal because they don't serve the interests of the state, or even reconsidering whether or not you agree with the interests of the state to begin with. This type of thinking directly opposes the goals of media and literary censorship. The Comics Code explicitly forbade content that might injure the sensibilities of the reader, meaning content that would force the reader to engage actively with those sensibilities. If the stories you read exist only to comfort you or instruct you about what is good and bad and right and wrong and acceptable and unacceptable, then you are left in a passive posture as a student, rather than getting the opportunity to explore the boundaries of your own perspective. If your access is limited to narratives that reinforce what you have already been told is important and correct, you never have to ask questions about what you do and don't agree with. If your sensibilities are never injured, then you will have no cause to decide for yourself whether you think those sensibilities are worth protection and at what and whose expense. While we do all that work, it's also necessary to directly oppose media and literary censorship because, frankly, we're a long way from convincing the state that violence against its own people in the name of criminal justice is not the answer. Exposure to a wide range of ideas and narratives will equip more people to engage in that fight against state-inflicted violence and the dehumanization of people called criminals. So right now, we have to work specifically against media censorship, especially book banning, which is the current forefront of media censorship efforts. We have to work to prevent readers, writers, librarians, filmmakers, artists, dancers, singers, and creatives across all fields from being assigned the label criminal in order to make our stories disappear. Now, there are a few actions you can take right now to help fight literary censorship and to exercise your compassion for the criminal. First of all, if you're an author or publishing professional of any kind, please sign up for Authors Against Book Bans or Publishing Professionals Against Book Bans. Even if you don't think you can do anything to pitch in, your name being with them gives them more strength to defend your rights. These two organizations are fighting book banning and censorship legislation across the US. Here are QR codes you can scan to get their respective websites. But tomorrow I'll have all of these and all the following resources up on my publication, Stone Soup. So if you're not able to keep track of everything, don't worry. You can go to stone.soup/ghost.io tomorrow to find both a transcript of this talk and links to all the resources I'm about to show you. You can also take a photo of this slide that's up right now, so you can come back to it when you're ready to see that list. You can also attend your local school board meetings and local city council meetings and speak up when you learn about efforts to ban and censor and challenge books in your local schools and libraries. Find out where to start at civicsearch.org. You can organize and attend de-escalation trainings so you know what to do in situations where violence is being used to enforce censorship or to victimize someone who has been assigned the status of criminal. You can find out more about how to organize those at deescalation-training.com. You can and should sign up for your local ICE Rapid Response Team so you can help support people who are currently being unpredictably assigned the status of criminal to justify the kidnappings and violence being inflicted upon them by the state. This is how you help them. You can also learn the identities of your representatives and contact them to make it clear that you, a voter in their constituency, do not support censorship, book banning, criminalization of creativity, or victimization of criminals. It feels scary to make that phone call, but once you start doing it, you'll recognize how much power you really have. It's well worth the courage and time it will take you. You can get involved with organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative, which is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, to challenging racial and economic injustice, and to protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. And last but certainly not least, you can get involved with organizations like Books to Prisoners. This is a project with the mission of getting books into the hands of incarcerated people. Because even as we strip them of their rights and treat them as less than human, the American prison system tightly controls what books criminals are and are not allowed to read. For example, How to Be an Anti-Racist is frequently banned in US prisons, but Mein Kampf is not. Now, those few steps are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to work that's already being done to make our country and our world a better place. This is work that's been happening for generations. People are and have been fighting for your rights as a reader, as a library professional, and as a human being. And you can be part of that fight. There's so much we can do, and we get to do it together. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm so sorry again that I'm not there in the room with you. I hope that you leave that room and I leave this room and find ourselves in a world where we can read, speak, think, love, and live freely. If we don't, if we find ourselves in a world like the one in Upright Women Wanted, where stories are tools of oppression rather than liberation, then I'll look forward to being a criminal right there alongside you. Thank you so much. Okay, friends, thank you for bearing with me while I got some water. I'm back to take some questions, and the first one I'm looking at here in the chat says, what kind of inspirational message can you give to a group of school librarians in light of the current political climate and the persecution of school librarians around the country? I mean, first of all, I'm rarely inclined to give suffering people inspirational messages because the reality is you are suffering. You do already impossibly hard work. And your work is being made harder by a political agenda that opposes the things that really librarianship is all about. For those who don't know, librarians do way more than recommend and hand out books. They also teach people how to take in and access information. Librarians are big wells of resource. If you come to a librarian and you say, I don't know how to write a resume, how do I start finding that out? The librarian will help you get that information. So I think that's the inspirational message I'd share is that your work is important beyond what they're attacking. The people who are attacking freedom to read think you just recommend and hand out books. And it sucks to have that interfered with. But they don't realize that you also can teach people how to recognize when they're being lied to, how to track down misinformation and filter it, and how to engage with the world around them in a curious and thoughtful way. Thank you so much for the work you do. I could not be more grateful to you for it. Well, the next question here says, is there a sequel? And if yes, what's your guesstimate its release? Unfortunately, I cannot answer that question, but thank you for asking it. And it sounds like you'll be the type of person who keeps their eyes peeled. So if that's what you want to do it. Someone is asking, did Flagstaff play a role in your depiction of endurance? Yes and no. I wouldn't say that I was directly referencing Flagstaff as I was writing endurance, but I was referencing a lot of different Southwestern American major metropolitan areas. And Flagstaff is one of those. So it would be dishonest to say no, but dishonest to say yes in any intentional way. How do you name your characters? Names like Amity are suggestive or ironic reflections of their personalities oftentimes. I love this question. Thank you so much for noticing that. I built the naming culture in Upright Women Wanted to be one that, similar to puritanical culture in early United States history, reflects the moral values of the people. They're being told that values like amity are important. So you might name your children something like Child of God or Born into Sin Without Torment. These are real names that are on Puritan era headstones. Super fun to go to those graveyards and do, kind of a scavenger hunt for these names. That's how I came up with most of these names. Unfortunately, I did kind of screw up in that I did the same thing in another book that I'm working on right now. And as a result, some of the characters have way too similar of names that I have to change them. But that's part of the work. Well, I'm here for any other questions over the next few minutes. And either way, if more questions are rolling in or not, I want to once again thank you so much, Ann Arbor District Library. The event staff there are incredible. They made all of this happen for you. And when I texted them an hour before I was supposed to show up saying I just tested positive for COVID, they snapped into action. I am so grateful and so impressed and so lucky to get to work with them. All right, I think this is the last question I'm seeing. Says, why the Wild West? And did you consider telling the story with a different setting? Well, first of all, no, I never considered telling the story with a different setting. I love pulp Western. My first two books, The American Hippo Duology, River of Teeth, and Taste of Marrow, are both pulp Westerns, and I wanted to return to that tone. But more than that, the setting in this book reads as the Wild West because there's no infrastructure or social support. All of the funding and infrastructure management has been pulled into the central corridor of the United States to support military activity. So all of the rubber for tires is being used for tanks. Well, if you can't get rubber for tires, you're going to start riding horses again. People are also isolated within their communities because of the way the regime of Upright Women Wanted benefits from isolation. And so it feels Wild Westy because you've got these small towns with little power dynamics that have big consequences. It's really what happens to countries that are under fascist authoritarianism for too long. Again, looking at the history of Japan and Germany and Italy, you can see the way road disrepair leads to people using old-fashioned technology to get around, the way cooking styles become different in moments of scarcity, the way that people treat each other differently when they're constantly told that they're under threat and have no resources. And it feels an awful lot like the Wild West. All right, my friends, I think I am due to take a Tylenol and try and break this fever before it breaks me. So I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you so much again, Ann Arbor District Library. You have been amazing. I hope everyone in that room is giving you a big round of applause. And if they're not, just know that I am here in my heart. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.